Think about how many people walk down the street every single day. Grey Street, right in the heart of Newcastle. They pass these grand buildings and just see a modern, thriving city. But what if I told you that for centuries these cities weren't really run by a mayor or council, but by a network of social societies? They call themselves mysteries. And these incredible, powerful trade guilds were the true architects of old Newcastle. They controlled everything you could buy or sell, pulled political strings from the shadows, and held the livelihoods of thousands in their hands. This is the story of how they rose to power and the dark secrets they kept, and how their legacy is still hidden in plain sight, if you know where to look. So how could a handful of organisations get control of an entire city? For that, we need to jump back to 1216. That's when King John gave Newcastle a royal charter, a document that let the town leading citizens form a merchant guild. This single act lit the fuse for centuries of secret power. At first, the idea was simple: a group of craftsmen and merchants coming together for mutual aid and protection. But in the medieval Newcastle, it became something much bigger. These groups became known as mysteries, not because they were solving crimes, but for the Latin word mysterium, which means a trade or craft. And believe me, they guarded their trade with absolute secrecy. By the early 1300s, 12 distinct companies officially up and running. You had 3 powerful merchant groups controlling wool, corn and silk, and 9 craft guilds, including skinners, butchers, bakers and smiths. Each guild was in its own little world. If you wanted to work in a certain trade, you had no choice but to join the guild. They set the prices, they dictated the quality, and they decided who even was allowed to work. But how does a group of merchants become a shadow government? Well, they wove themselves into the very fabric of Newcastle's politics. The guilds created this complex election system where each mystery would elect its own representative. These representatives would then choose the mayor. It was a closed loop, making sure their political power never left the hands of the guild elite. The city wasn't just their marketplace, it was their fortress. By the 1500s, the guilds were at the absolute height of their power. There were as many as 36 different guilds running in Newcastle, each the master of its own little universe. But 2 of them stood above all the rest, like titans of industry and politics: the merchant adventurers and the notorious horsemen. The Merchant Adventurers Guild, made officially in 1516, was basically an elite club for Newcastle's wealthiest merchants. They controlled the city's very profitable export trade in wool and other goods. They operated out of the magnificent Guild Hall on the quayside, a building that still stands as a monument to their power. The rules were designed to keep that power in-house, with regulations often requiring leaders to be former officials. This made sure control stayed within a tiny circle of the families. But if the merchant adventurers were the city's sophisticated boardroom, the horsemen were the ruthless enforcers. The horsemen controlled something way more valuable than wool. They controlled coal. Starting in the mid-13th century, they built a complete and total monopoly over the export of coal from the River Tyne. Before the world ran on oil, it ran on coal, and the horsemen of Newcastle were the first real cartel. They got their name from the old practice of hosting, where they provided the lodgings for visiting merchants, and was a clever way of controlling their access to local trade, but their methods weren't always so hospitable. The horsemen owned the keels, that's the big boats used to get the coal from the riverbanks to the ships, and they employed the city's keelmen, who often had a tough, conflicted relationship with their powerful bosses. Thanks to a royal act in 1530, all coal shipments from the Tyne were legally forced to go through the Newcastle quayside, cementing the horsemen's monopoly. They became known as the Lords of the Coal, buying up mines and controlling both production and sales. Their power was so absolute that the phrase "taking coals to Newcastle," meaning a pointless task, was first recorded back in 1538. You know what they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The guild didn't just maintain the standards, they crushed their competition. They suffocated innovation, and they ruled through exclusion and force. If you weren't a member, you weren't just an outsider, you were an enemy. Newcastle's history is filled with conflicts sparked by the iron grip. As early as 1305, a group of poor inhabitants revolted against the rich merchants' monopolies, a desperate cry against a system that was built to keep them down. The horsemen especially were infamous for their violent tactics. In 1267, long before their monopoly was even official, the mayor of Newcastle, who happened to be a merchant, led an army group to a rival port in North Shields and burned several buildings to the ground just to wipe out the competition. Though violence and slick politic moves, they managed to get the king to suspend all trade in North Shields, turning it into little more than a fishing port. The exclusionary attitude went beyond businesses. When the Quakers emerged in the 17th century, they faced intense persecution. The powerful Merchant Adventurers Guild officially condemned them as heretics, using their institutional power to push out anyone with different beliefs. And even more mysterious were groups like the Irish Ribbonmen, a suspected secret Catholic society in the 1830s that might have been hiding its activities as Newcastle's Hibernian Benevolent Fund. The city's magnificent Guildhall itself bears the scars of all the conflicts. In 1740, after a bad harvest sent food prices soaring, prices controlled by the Guild, a furious crowd of 3,000 people stormed the building. They destroyed priceless records and beautiful woodwork in an explosion of anger against the powerful few who held the city's fate in their hands. Have you heard of similar secret trade groups or societies in your own city history? Let us know in the comments below. As the industrial age began, the guild's purely economic power started to weaken. But the idea of a secret brotherhood didn't just fade away, it just changed its shape. In the 18th century, a different kind of secret society began to boom in Newcastle, the Freemasonry. Freemasonry officially showed up in Northumberland around 1730, and by 1734 the area had its first provincial Grand Master. But unlike the guilds, which were all about monopolies and profit, the Freemasons were centred on the principles of brotherhood, charity and self-improvement. It brought in men from all walks of life who could meet as equals no matter their job or social status. But just like the guilds, they had their own secret rituals. The first purpose-built Masonic Hall in Newcastle was set up at Maple Terrace in 1870, a building paid for by local lodges that's still active today. Other grand halls followed, like the Central Masonic Hall in 1897 and the lodge at the old Assembly Rooms. While their meetings were private, the three Masons weren't totally hidden. They often played a very public and civil role, which is a fascinating paradox for a secret society. They held public processions and laid the foundation stones for major city landmarks, including Berwick Pier in 1810, and most famously Literary and Philosophical Society building in 1822. That event was even attended by the Duke of Sussex, who was the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England. This public face was crucial. It showed that they were a respectable, law-abiding organisation that supported the Crown, from the shadows of economic control to respectable halls of the Brotherhood. The nature of Newcastle's secret society was changing. The world that let its ancient guilds thrive couldn't last forever. The 19th century brought huge reforms across Britain. The Municipal Corporations Act of 1835 was pretty much a death blow to the old way of doing things, taking apart the corrupt election system that had kept the guilds in power for centuries. The monopolies were broken and the political stranglehold was finally gone. But they didn't just disappear. Their legacy is still etched into the very stones of Newcastle. You just have to know where to look. The magnificent Guildhall still dominates the quayside. Its grand halls and carved oak, a direct link to the centuries of power held by the merchant adventurers. Today, part of it is a hard rock cafe, a strange modern twist for a site of medieval power. Nearby, a 16th century merchant's house called the Cooperage still stands, a building once used by the guild themselves. If you wander into the area around Blackfriars, which was leased to 9 craft guilds back in 1552, you can even find more direct clues. While many of their meeting halls are gone, the names and symbols survive. The coat of arms of the city's corporation decorate the banqueting hall ceiling of the guild hall, a colourful catalogue of skinners, saddlers and smiths who once ran the city. And though it's not a hall anymore, the old cordwainers or shoemakers hall has its coat of arms carved in the stone right above the original door, a permanent reminder that they were here. The three Masons too have left their mark. Guildhall on Maple Street and in Jesmond still host meetings today, continuing traditions that are now centuries old. And the guilds themselves, they haven't entirely vanished. The Horsemen's Company, the ancient cartel of coal, still exists as a corporate ghost of its former self. And the free men of the guilds of Newcastle still hold the right to graze cattle on the town moor, a curious and ancient privilege that saved the huge green space from developers. And even up Granger Street, you'll see the Chancellor building, and if you look up, you'll see the symbols for the Freemasons. The top 2 floors were their halls. So the next time you walk the streets of Newcastle, look a little closer. Look at the names carved on the buildings, the coats of arms above the doors, and the grand halls seem a bit out of place in the modern city. You're not just looking at old architecture, you're seeing the echoes of a secret history, a history of powerful mysteries and brotherhoods that controlled commerce, shaped politics and built the city from the shadows. Their world may be gone, but the blueprint they left behind is everywhere. If you enjoyed this journey into Newcastle's hidden past, make sure to subscribe, give this video the thumbs up and hit that notification bell for more historical deep dives. Thanks for watching.